across Africa has a key role to play in the continent's development. Unfortunately, trade has been underexploited in Africa. Targeted emerging policy reforms may provide the required drive for progress on trade facilitation. The establishment of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the emphasis on boosting intra-African trade are key priorities of the continent development vision under the African Union's Agenda 2063, the future we want for Africa. This rather ambitious trade agenda is reinforced by important trade-related targets that are included as means of implementation for the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which contains several other trade elements for Africa. Developing Africa's maritime industry for economic growth is just one of the issues that will be on the front burner on Maritime Radar. I'm Nneoma Obi-Asualo. In Africa, both the processes and degree of regional integration have lagged behind expectation. The many political commitments have either not translated into policy and regulatory reforms or have simply not been implemented. This leaves the region weakly integrated, with continued tariff barriers, for example, where restrictive rules of origin cannot be met. Global markets offer important opportunities for companies in developing countries for them to export to larger markets. Rather than focusing on smaller domesticated markets, taking advantage of these opportunities will increase production, growth, and employment. Developing countries, like many of those across Africa, must overcome several hurdles before being able to export to global markets. Looking at this critically, regional markets must become the required testing ground for local African companies. Barriers to accessing markets in the region are often lower than those of the global markets, as they share similar tastes, standards, distance, and culture. We'll get deeper into what the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement can do for the 54 countries of the continent after we look at the latest news from the maritime industry. Stay with us.
The Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, IMO, Kitak Lim, in his keynote address at the 2022 Nigerian International Maritime Summit, said that maritime countries need finance to invest in fossil fuels. He noted that this would help reduce their carbon footprint in the environment. Lim further stressed the need for the adoption of market-based approaches to help generate funds used for the technological development of fossil fuels.
I'd like to express my appreciation to the government of Nigeria for organizing this highly meaningful event to examine how we can ignite the blue economy. I'm aware of the significant relevance of Nigeria to the maritime industry in the West African sub-region and the strong maritime tradition that has seen a key involvement in the work of IMO.
Developing countries are more and more feeling the impact of climate change. This has made decarbonization one of the biggest challenges of our time. The IMO Secretary General Kitak Lim reiterated the organization's support for Nigeria's maritime industry in order for it to have cleaner oceans and a greener shipping system. Lim pointed out that one of the successes of the Nigerian Navy and the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NMASA, was their ability to effectively collaborate with local, regional, and international partners to achieve success in the war against piracy.
IMO will continue to support developing countries with our capacity building as well as partnerships and the project aimed at supporting an inclusive transition. Decarbonization gives us not only challenges, but also many opportunity, which was mentioned by earlier speakers in many different ways. Automation and digitalization are also critical to shaping the future. IMO seeks to embrace the benefits of new technologies.
The chairman of the Nigerian Sheep Owners Forum, Margaret Orakwisi, who is also chairman of Morbid Group, has raised concerns over the issue of Nigeria waters being invaded by foreign trawlers. Speaking at the Nigerian International Maritime Summit in Lagos, she stressed the need to curb the activities of these foreign fishermen who are encroaching in the coastal waters of countries without restraint.
We have called once again international attention to IUU, and that is irresponsible, undocumented, unregulated fishing activities being carried out by the big countries with their big vessels, and they come in such an irresponsible manner. They deplete our both the juveniles, both the old ones that lay the golden eggs. Industrial fishing is highly regulated.
The detention of the tanker Heroic Idun, its 26 crew in Equatorial Guinea, and their subsequent extradition to Nigeria, where they will be charged with oil theft, has led to a renewed call to stop the criminalization of seafarers. Speaking at the Crew Connect Global in Manila, Philippines, the maritime coordinator of the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF, Jacqueline Smith, said the criminalization of seafarers must stop. She noted that the stories of seafarers being detained for months without charge or arrested on the suspicion of crimes created challenges to convince young people that the industry is good. Smith further stressed that governments needed to ensure that seafarers receive fair treatment rather than being treated as if they were criminals. During the COVID-19 pandemic, world leaders relied on seafarers to deliver goods, but at the same time stopped seafarers from going ashore, being repatriated home at the end of their contracts, and even denied them life-saving medical care.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa First.
This is Maritime Radar. This week's episode will assess the African continental free trade area, particularly its importance in economic growth and integration for Africa. I spoke to Dr. Kofi Mbiah, a maritime law consultant and chief executive of the Ghana Chamber of Shipping, on trade facilitation, a tool for Africa's economic growth and integration. Let's start this conversation looking at trade. Trade has a key role to play in driving economic growth. What, in your view, is trade facilitation?
Simply put, trade facilitation is the elimination of barriers or hindrances to the movement of cargo from the places of manufacture to places of consumption. Simply put. So the hindrances, the barriers that do not make the free flow of goods and services is what we refer to. Its removal is what we refer to as trade facilitation.
So what then is the benefits of trade facilitation?
Yes, you know, no country can thrive without trade, because no country can be self-sufficient in every respect of the word, and therefore it means that countries must trade amongst themselves. The advantages of trade is Sometimes you have what we call comparative advantage or competitive advantage. There are things which you can produce in your place, maybe at cheaper costs. And consequently, it will be important for you to be able to export them to other places and get things from other places into your economy as well. It is this exchange that makes economies to grow. And that is why trading itself has been there since time immemorial. From the time when salt and cowries to spices were moved from one end of continents to another, the value has been realized that you need to move necessarily goods from one place to another place in order that you can create value for both parties.
Okay, looking at the African Continental Free Trade Area, which started in 2021, it is significant for Africa's political and economic aspirations. How do you think this agreement has fared?
Yes, thank you very much. You will recall that there were a few teething problems before we were able to get into the African Continental Free Trade Area, especially a very big player like Nigeria, felt that, look, unless certain things were put in place, it could not, as it were, subscribe to the agreement. But eventually, Nigeria came on board. A number of countries were also on board. All of this must be set against the backdrop that you are looking at Africa in its entirety. You are looking at a population of about 1.3 billion, expected to grow by 2030 to about 2 billion population. And with this kind of population, it is clear that if you were to create a market for this population, then it becomes the largest, if you like, free trade area in the world. And it's important to bear in mind that if you should get trade to move among the parties in Africa, you are talking about a GDP growth of almost $3.4 trillion, dollars. And the challenge for Africa has always been generating that kind of growth that would lead to the realization of such gross domestic product.
Do you now think that the agenda is ambitious?
Yes, the agenda is ambitious. There is no doubt about that. But I think starting off, it ought to be ambitious. As they say sometimes, aim at the stars and fall on the moon. So it's ambitious, but it has to start from somewhere. And because of all of the benefits that are likely to be derived, it is important to bear in mind that this is something that is important for Africa. You ask the question, how far have we come? You will recall that we concluded this agreement way back in 2019 is when it entered into force. COVID then came. We could not begin implementation. Implementation had to be postponed until about 2021, as you mentioned. And since then, there have been a few developments towards progress. Because there are three key things that are important to realize. First, there needed to be policy reform. All of our countries and also our regions, whether it is SADC, whether it is ECOWAS, whether it is the East African sub-region, all of them, the point is that there are national policies and there are regional policies. How do we integrate all of these policies into an African policy? And so there were policy reforms that needed to be done, trade facilitation measures that ought to be put on board, and then regulatory measures as well that we needed to look at. So from 2021 to now, I would say that there has not been much development. Only recently in Ghana, there was a shipment from Ghana to Senegal under the AFTA rules. But remember that issues regarding rules of origin continue to be problematic, especially when you look at the least developed countries within Africa as against big players such as maybe Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa, and those are the imbalances that ought to be ironed out. So there hasn't been very, very significant progress, but where the AfTA have taken off, it has taken off.
You mentioned a lot of barriers to this trade agreement. Do you think infrastructure is one of those barriers? And how do you think we can work out this infrastructure to drive trade in the West and Central African sub-region?
Very important, very important. It is key. It is at the heart, of AfTA. Because when we talk about infrastructure, we are talking about infrastructure for the transportation of goods and services. And we are talking about infrastructure that enables the underpinning factor of the free movement of goods and persons, so that quality labor, for example, can move from one place to the other. When the infrastructure is right, you need to also have the regulatory and administrative framework to be right. So these two ingredients are critical to the development of AfTA. I mean, look at infrastructure. Look, if you look at the trade and you make comparisons, just around 2017, if you take Europe, for example, trade between European countries is around 55 to 59%. If you take Asia, it's also around 50 to 59%. If you take America, over 50%, the Americas. In Africa, it's just between 12 to 15%, And indeed, to be able to trade amongst yourself, the infrastructure ought to be right. We don't have working rail systems. We don't have connectivity with respect to our air transport systems. So if perishable cargo, for example, needs to be moved very quickly, if urgent equipment like mining equipment, spares, need to be moved for machinery, for manufacturing, to what extent are you going to move these to the places where manufacturing is taking place? Because our road network is bad, our rail network is bad, our air services is bad as it stands now. So the infrastructure is just not right for getting AfTA to realize its aims and objectives. But I need to very quickly mention that I know that it's a matter that has come before the AU Commission, and the AU Commission has a project, for the development of key infrastructure in Africa generally, developing transnational highways, and then building rail systems. How soon all of these take off, it's very important, because sometimes, there have been the naysayers who say, look, you needed to have your infrastructure in place before you can talk about your AfTA, And so that is key. I've talked about the infrastructure, which you mentioned is critical. You need to have your administrative and legal frameworks appropriate. So the level of inspection, for example, we talked about trade facilitation. To what extent do you stop cargo at borders? What level of intrusion do you need to do with respect to inspections?
The importance of this intra-African trade cannot be overemphasized. Is it that we don't understand the importance because we need to trade among ourselves before we can even think of exporting whatever we have in Africa? Do you think that we don't even understand the importance of this trade, or we don't have the political will?
Yeah, I think we do understand the importance, and there is no doubt that the data is real, the data is clear. We know the importance.
So why are we not driving this trade with the speed it deserves?
Yeah, you mentioned the word. The word that we dread to say is political will. 2 words, political will. There is always feet dragging from one end to the other, and consequently, this feet dragging has not enabled our countries to have that political will that drives, if you like, the impetus for the key ingredients to be realized. I've mentioned the rules of origin. I have mentioned, for example, if you want to look at the common currency that we talked about, even in ECOWAS, the sub-regional areas, all of these are not working. So how do we then come and bring them together? You know, it's very, very important that we get these things right. Yeah.
We are import dependent. How can we move away from being import dependent and move into exporting what we produce here in Africa?
It only takes, again, the political will. There is a lot of capacity, and we can start off. You know, if you take China and you look back 30 years ago, China was just like Africa in terms of manufacturing, in terms of export. You know, China was just like Africa, but they took it upon themselves to begin to consume what they produce, you know, and then gradually elevate themselves to the next level where they are able then to export to other countries. So the starting point for Africa must be first within the framework of AFTA, produce and consume.
Okay.
Produce and consume. So when you begin to produce and consume, and then you perfect your systems, it is then that you can become competitive in the global arena. But if you don't start off, then you would continue to be import dependent. And for as long as you are import dependent, you cannot improve your systems, your structures, your mechanisms to ensure that you have export in the long run.
Let's bring it home. What are the bold steps that the Ghanaian government have taken to promote trade?
Again, while some attempts have been made, quite frankly, it is still window dressing. You know, it is still window dressing. Window dressing because there are key ingredients that I say we need to take steps to develop, to make sure it is done. To what extent are we removing non-tariff barriers, the NTBs, you know, the non-tariff barriers? To what extent are we removing them in the first place, even with the inadequate infrastructure that we have? We still have transit cargo moving to the landlocked economies, either from Nigeria, you know, going towards Mali, etc., or from Ghana going to Burkina Faso, or from Cote d'Ivoire. To what extent have we removed the non-tariff barriers? You know, it is still cumbersome. As I speak, it's still cumbersome. The road network is still not good. But these are the starting points where emphasis must be placed, where resources must be channeled. By this time, we should be looking at a standard gauge railway all the way from Abidjan or from Liberia going across all the way to Nigeria. You know, a standard gauge railway. Unfortunately, we are still not there.
Does it mean that our government in Africa does not understand the importance of trade?
They do understand. I have no doubt that they do understand. The issue is that there is so much of, if you like, self-centeredness, you know, such that issues, for example, of security abound, you know, and the desire of the political kingpins to entrench themselves in power is such that every time they are looking over their shoulders. Therefore, they are not looking at issues of facilitating the trade, which they know is so important, but which they place, if you like, in terms of ranking below their own self-centered political aspirations. Because of that, between Benin and Nigeria, between Togo and Ghana, we still have times when for the least thing that happens, a border is closed. The border is closed. Today in Europe, you are going across all borders without knowing that you have moved, for example, from Denmark to Sweden. You would not know that you have moved from Denmark to Sweden. It's a free flow, you know. But over here, the security considerations are key for us because of the self-centered political ambition. So every time we are on guard, you know, and we need to elevate this status to a state where we can build such infrastructure that makes it possible to build networks of intelligence and be using more non-intrusive mechanisms, intelligent mechanisms, sharing of information, for security consideration, random checks, and not consistent in checking every vehicle that is passing through a transit corridor. Until these things start, we have not really taken off as far as the AFTA is concerned.
I must thank you most kindly for coming on Maritime Radar. It's been Dr. Kofi Mbiah. He is a maritime consultant. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the program.
Africa needs its own storytellers, people who understand the continent because they're from it. People who know that news is more than just a conversation starter, it's our stories. Because these stories run deeper than headlines and segments. It's about digging deeper to get the facts and telling the human side of every single story, not just the echoes from foreign headlines and perspectives. It's time to take back our narratives and share them in our voices. The birth of Africa's New Age reporting, and this is where it begins, right here at News Central TV, the stories that put Africa first.
And that's all on this week's episode on Maritime Radar. Join me every week as we explore how Africa can unlock the potential of its maritime industry and its connected sector. I'll bring you the latest maritime news as well as talk to the experts, the policymakers, and industry professionals on issues concerning the growth and development of this economically critical sector. Until next week, I'm Nneoma Obi-Asualo. Many thanks for watching.